In a sterile hospital room, where the scent of antiseptic couldn't erase the breath of fate, Jacob Elijah, a man who once held the world in his grasp, received the news: 6 months to live. But destiny, with its cruel sense of humor, handed him one final dream, a child to carry on his legacy. Emily, the loyal maid with eyes as clear as a summer sky, stepped into that storm, unaware that love and miracles would bloom on the fragile line between life and death. Can a heart counting its final beats defy the reaper? Stay with us, for this story isn't just about survival, it's about what remains when the last breath fades. Mr. Jacob, I need you to stay calm, Dr. Miana's voice echoed steadily, like the ticking of a clock, in the stark white hospital room, where the overwhelming scent of antiseptic filled the air, so strong it seemed capable of wiping away every speck of dust, yet powerless to cleanse the weight of the words hanging in the air, sharp as a blade. Jacob Elijah, a living legend, a man who had built an empire from nothing with his own hands, now sat motionless on the cold hospital bed. His hands, once signing million-dollar contracts, were now gripping the pristine white bedsheet so tightly that his knuckles turned pale, as if trying to strangle the cruel truth that had just been spoken: terminal pancreatic cancer. 6 months. No more. 6 months, those 2 words felt like a death sentence written in bold red ink, stabbing straight into his chest. This can't be, he muttered, his voice hoarse, his once piercing gaze now clouded like a storm-laden sky. I feel fine. There must be some mistake. But Dr. Miana, with that infuriating calmness, simply tilted his head, pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, and replied as if reciting a restaurant menu, "We've run the tests twice, Mr. Jacob. I'm very sorry." Then he paused, his gaze flickering with a trace of pity, a look Jacob despised. "It would be best if you started preparing yourself." Prepare himself? How laughable. At 55, Jacob had everything: wealth stacked like mountains, power that commanded respect, fear, and admiration, even from his enemies. Yet now, he had nothing, no heir, no one to carry on the empire he had painstakingly built. It would all soon fall into the hands of greedy relatives, vultures in human form, or opportunists waiting to tear apart his legacy like a pack of hungry wolves. There has to be a way, he growled, slamming his fist on the bed, the impact ringing out like a challenge hurled at death itself. I don't care about comfort. I want to live. But the doctor remained silent. His eyes seemed to say, "Sir, I am not God." For the first time in decades, Jacob Elijah, the man whose words could shake the world, felt powerless. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his heart pounded as if trying to break free from his chest, but nothing could change the crushing reality suffocating him. Meanwhile, in Jacob's grand mansion, Emily, the faithful housemaid of 8 years, wiped her rough hands on her worn apron. She set a tray of freshly squeezed orange juice on the polished walnut dining table, its sweet fragrance a feeble comfort in the heavy silence. 8 years. She had seen Jacob in his most triumphant days, his tailored suits impeccable, his commanding voice resonating through high-stakes meetings, his gaze sharp enough to make even the most confident men tremble. But today, as she looked at him seated in his massive leather armchair, the throne of this very house, all she saw was a withering shadow. Jacob was no longer an unyielding mountain, he was an ancient tree battered by storms, its branches drooping, its roots shaken. "Sir, are you all right?" Emily asked softly, her voice barely a whisper, afraid that anything louder might shatter him. Jacob flinched as if pulled from a nightmare. His eyes found hers, but the light in them had dimmed. His face was pale, the deep lines etched across it carved deeper by invisible pain. "Do I look all right, Emily?" he answered, his voice bitter, like chewing on an unripe orange peel. "I just got back from the hospital. They told me I have 6 months left." Emily inhaled sharply, her hand flying to her mouth, her wide eyes filled with horror. "No. That can't be. You're strong, full of life. It must be a mistake." But Jacob only let out a dry chuckle, a sound utterly devoid of mirth. Apparently, Cancer doesn't care how strong I am, he murmured, exhaling a shaky breath, as if his soul itself was splintering. He leaned forward, pressing his fingers to his temple, his once powerful hands now trembling. Emily hesitated, her small steps bringing her closer, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. "Sir, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" Jacob lifted his head, his gaze locking onto her with the intensity of a storm-tossed sea. He, who had never begged anyone, never bowed to anyone, was now looking at her with raw desperation. "Yes, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There is something you can do for me." She frowned, her heart pounding. "Anything, sir. Just say the word." Jacob swallowed hard, his lips pressed together as if waging a war within himself. Then, he spoke, each word dropping like lead. "I need an heir, Emily. Someone to carry my name, my legacy. And I want you, to bear my child." Time seemed to freeze. Emily's breath hitched, the room suddenly feeling suffocatingly small, the air thick and heavy, pressing against her chest. "Sir, what did you just say?" she whispered, her voice so faint it nearly vanished into the silence. Jacob ran a hand over his face, his exhaustion evident in every weary movement. "I need you to have my child, Emily. I know this is sudden, insane, even, but I don't have time. 6 months. That's all I've got. I cannot die without an heir." Emily stepped back, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. "Sir, I don't understand. Why me?" Jacob held her gaze, his voice resolute like an oath. "Because you're the only person I trust. 8 years in this house, and you've never betrayed me. Never stolen a dime, never sold my secrets to the vultures in the media. You are kind, patient, hard-working, the very qualities I need in the mother of my child." Emily's face burned, her breaths uneven. "Sir. I'm still a virgin," she stammered, her fingers trembling as they clutched the fabric of her apron. Jacob blinked, genuine surprise flickering across his face. "You've never?" She nodded, averting her gaze. "Never. With anyone? How can you ask me to do this, for my first time?" For a moment, hesitation flickered in Jacob's eyes. But then, his expression hardened with resolve. "I know this is difficult, Emily. But think about it, I will take care of you for the rest of your life. You and our child will never want for anything. I'm not asking for love, I just need an heir." His voice softened, nearly pleading. "Please, Emily." That plea cut through her like a dagger. Jacob Elijah, the man who had once stood atop the world, was now begging her. Not with his knees, but with his eyes, his desperation laid bare. Emily felt dizzy. She had grown up in a strict household where purity was sacred, something to be saved for love. But now, standing before this man, a man on the brink of disappearing like a dying candle, she felt herself teetering between faith and compassion. Could she do it? Could she sacrifice everything she had believed in to grant a dying man his final wish? The question hung in the air, heavy, suffocating, in the silence that followed. The days passed in Jacob's vast mansion like droplets of water slowly falling from a leaky faucet, seemingly peaceful yet unbearably heavy. Tension seeped into every corner, clinging to the deep crimson velvet curtains, saturating the polished wood scent of the lavish furnishings. Jacob Elijah, a man once renowned for his unwavering determination, had become a shadow of himself, repeating the same words, an anomaly in his lifelong consistency. Each time Emily entered the room, whether to bring a gleaming silver tray of tea or dust the antique frames, he found a way to revive the conversation. Sometimes, it was with a pleading gaze, other times, with a hoarse voice that crashed like waves against jagged rocks, he repeated the request that made her want to flee. "Emily, think about it. I don't have much time left." At first, Emily mastered the art of avoidance. She scrubbed the floors so long that the tiles gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the fear in her eyes. She rearranged the library shelves twice over, running her fingers over the books as if they were talismans warding off the inevitable confrontation. She even stood by the sink for hours, polishing silverware until they shimmered like moonlight, anything to keep from looking up, from facing him. But no matter how skillfully she evaded, the weight of Jacob's words clung to her like a shadow under dim candlelight, persistent, haunting, inescapable. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the grand parlor in its final golden glow, Emily stepped in and found Jacob sitting there, swallowed by darkness. His head rested in his frail hands, silver-haired, disheveled like dry grass after a storm. He no longer resembled a king on his throne but a defeated warrior struck by fate's final blow. "My lord," she whispered, her voice trembling like rustling leaves in the wind, afraid that a louder sound might make him vanish. Jacob looked up, his gaunt face hollowed by exhaustion she had never seen before. "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable, Emily," he murmured, his voice no louder than a lost soul's whisper. I don't know what else to do." Emily's heart clenched, a sharp, aching twist in her chest. In 8 years under this roof, she had witnessed Jacob at the pinnacle of power, commanding boardrooms like a maestro, signing ruthless deals that made rivals tremble, intimidating even the wealthiest men in the country with a single piercing glance. But now, he was just a man facing death, alone, afraid, stripped bare in a way that made her want to weep. She took a deep breath, her ribs trembling with restraint. "If I agree, what happens next?" she asked, her voice small but steady, like a stone breaking the stillness of a silent lake. Jacob straightened, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes like embers stirred from cold ashes. "I will make sure you're taken care of," he vowed, his voice as firm as an oath before the gods. "Everything will be put in writing, you and the child will inherit everything. You'll never have to worry for a single day of your life." Emily swallowed hard, her throat as parched as a desert. She had never imagined motherhood, let alone this way, a contract with a man counting his remaining days. But looking at him, she saw more than just her employer, she saw a man unraveling, desperately clinging to the last flicker of his existence. She exhaled slowly, her heartbeat pounding like war drums. "All right, my lord," she said. "I'll do it." Jacob's eyes widened, glowing like stars in the night sky. She nodded, hesitant, uncertain, but enough to bring the first smile to his lips in weeks. Yet deep inside, Emily wondered if she had just unlocked the gates of heaven or stepped into the abyss of hell. That night, in her small bedroom, she lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, where shadows stretched in eerie shapes. "I agreed," she murmured to herself. But as the reality settled in, it crashed over her like a tidal wave, fear, uncertainty, and something nameless gnawing at her chest. "It's just a medical procedure," she reassured herself, picturing a doctor in a crisp white coat, cold and methodical. Nothing more. The next morning, she gathered her courage and stood before Jacob's office door. Her knock was soft, barely louder than the erratic beating of her heart. "Come in," his deep voice called, stronger than the night before. She stepped in, hands gripping the fabric of her dress. Jacob sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his pristine white shirt draping over his gaunt frame, but today he looked different, like a withered tree finally given water. "I've thought a lot about this, my lord," she began, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "Since I agreed, I think we should proceed with artificial insemination. It's the safest way, and there won't be any complications." Jacob leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, his gaze quiet and unreadable. A heavy silence settled over the room, thick as velvet drapes smothering sound. Then he sighed, a deep, weary breath as if exhaling his very soul. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than ever, "I need to be honest with you." She frowned, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" He lowered his head, then met her eyes, his gaze as deep as the ocean. I don't want this to be just a clinical process. If we do this, I want it to be natural. That would mean everything to me. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her lungs suddenly starved for air. You're asking me to? Yes, Jacob interrupted, his voice gentle but unwavering. I know I'm asking a lot, but I want to feel connected to my child from the very beginning. I want to experience that moment, not just read about it on a medical report. Emily shook her head, stepping back, her hands clenched as if grasping for something solid. But my lord, I told you, I'm still untouched. This isn't something I take lightly. Jacob's eyes darkened, glistening with emotion. And I respect that, Emily. But if you do this for me, I swear, you and our child will never suffer. I will ensure it for the rest of my life. Her hands trembled, the values instilled in her from childhood screaming in her head. Refuse. Protect your purity. But then she looked at Jacob, truly looked at him. He was no longer the powerful master of the house, but a dying man, holding his last dream in trembling hands. She was the only light he had left to reach for. Think about it, he murmured, his voice a ghostly whisper, soft yet magnetic, like a call from the depths of fate. Emily stood frozen, torn between compassion and conviction, between the woman she had always been and the woman she might become. The question hung in the air. Would she choose sacrifice, or denial? Emily turned on her heels and left the office, her heart pounding wildly like the echoing drums of battle in her chest. The door clicked shut behind her, but the sound did nothing to halt the storm of thoughts spiraling through her mind. She walked forward, her legs heavy as if weighed down by lead, before locking herself in her small room for hours. This wasn't just about money or security, no, it ran far deeper than that. Jacob Elijah, that powerful man, had never been just an employer in her eyes. When her mother fell ill, bedridden with medical bills stacking up like mountains, it was Jacob who quietly shouldered the burden, paying for everything without hesitation. When her younger brother, bright-eyed but penniless, was on the verge of dropping out of school, it was Jacob who stepped in, covering the tuition so the boy could dream beyond their rundown neighborhood. He never treated her like a mere servant, he regarded her as family. Now, curled up on the old armchair in the corner of her room, Emily felt like a small bird standing before a gilded cage, yearning to fly, yet paralyzed with fear. That evening, after a dinner where the scent of roasted meat still lingered in the air, she entered Jacob's study. He stood there, his tall, slender figure silhouetted against the deep red velvet curtains, his somber gaze fixed on the window as if trying to pierce through the darkness beyond. The golden glow from the antique desk lamp illuminated the deep lines on his face, marks of time and the burdens he bore. As she stepped forward, her footsteps barely audible against the wooden floor, he turned, his eyes lighting up like a lighthouse guiding a lost traveler. "Emily," he said, his voice cautious yet filled with hope. She took a deep breath, her chest trembling as if it might shatter. "Sir, I've made my decision," she said, swallowing hard against the dryness in her throat. Jacob straightened, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as though bracing himself. "I'll do it," she continued, her voice soft but steady, like a brook flowing through a dense forest. A wave of relief washed over Jacob's face, his lips parting as if to speak, but she raised a hand to stop him. "But not for the money. Not for the inheritance," she emphasized, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I'm doing this because you've always been good to me, to my family. You gave me opportunities one never dared to dream of. You cared for us like we were your own. This is how I repay you." Jacob blinked, clearly taken aback by her words. "Emily, I don't even know what to say," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled faintly, as delicate as the morning dew on a petal. "Just promise me one thing, sir." "Anything," he answered instantly, like a bolt of lightning. "Be honest with me. This isn't just about an heir. A child needs love, a family, a future. If I do this, I need to know that you'll be there, until the very end. Jacob stepped closer, his gaze deep and unreadable, like an old painting faded by time. "I promise you, Emily," he said, his voice warm and rich, like the deep notes of a cello in the quiet of the night. "I will give this child all the love I have, and I will never let you regret this decision." Emily nodded, feeling a slight weight lift from her heart. But she knew, there was no turning back from this moment onward. That night, in her small bedroom, Emily stood before the mirror, her fingers trembling as they traced the silk nightgown Jacob had given her. It was as delicate as the morning mist, so soft that she felt like a princess in a fairy tale, except this story had no prince, only a dying man and the last dream of his life. Her heart pounded wildly, threatening to burst from her chest as she thought about what lay ahead. She had agreed, but now, fear slithered into her bones like a venomous serpent. "How did I end up here?" she whispered to her reflection, her voice so faint that only she could hear it. A knock on the door shattered the silence, firm yet gentle, making her startle like a deer awakened in the forest. "Emily," Jacob's voice called from the other side, steady but soft, like waves lapping against a rocky shore. She drew in a deep breath, gripping the hem of her gown, then opened the door. Jacob stood there, dressed in a simple white robe, his gaze tender yet unfathomably deep, like the night sky brimming with 1,000 stars. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, his voice smooth as velvet, his eyes searching hers for confirmation. Emily nodded, though her body remained tense as a bowstring. "I gave you my word, sir." He smiled, a rare, gentle smile that melted some of the solemnity from his face. He reached out, resting a light hand on her shoulder, his touch as soft as a butterfly landing on a flower. "Tonight, I don't want you to see me as your employer," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper in the quiet room. "I don't want this to be an obligation. I want you to feel at ease, to trust me." She swallowed, her throat as dry as desert sand. "I do trust you, sir." Jacob shook his head, chuckling softly. "No formalities tonight. Just call me Jacob." She hesitated, then murmured, "All right. Jacob." He took her hand, his grip warm and steady despite the frailty of his illness, and led her into his grand bedroom. Candlelight flickered across the walls, casting warm shadows that danced like echoes of old stories. Emily had stepped into this room hundreds of times before, to dust the intricately carved wooden bed, to arrange books on the shelves, but tonight, everything felt different. The familiar space had transformed into an unfamiliar stage, where she was no longer just a maid but the central figure in a play written by fate. Her heart pounded, a mix of fear and curiosity swirling within her as the door closed behind them, leaving only the two of them standing before the night that would change everything. Emily sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her lap, rigid as a wooden statue in the dim candlelit room. The smooth white silk sheets embraced her, but they couldn't soothe the wild pounding of her heart, galloping like a runaway horse in her chest. Jacob sat beside her, just a small distance away, his dark brown eyes watching her carefully, like a hunter observing his prey in silence, cautious not to startle it. "You're anxious," he said, his voice as gentle as a breeze whispering through autumn leaves. She exhaled shakily, her breath coming in uneven bursts, as if trying to escape her chest. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice as small as the whisper of a lost child. Jacob leaned in, his hand lifting her chin with a delicate touch. The warmth of it was reassuring, like the first rays of sunlight drying the cold morning dew. "You don't have to do anything, Emily," he murmured, his gaze locking onto hers, deep, endless, like an unfathomable ocean. "Just trust me." She looked at him, her breath quickened, and as he leaned down, his lips met hers, softly, slowly, like the opening note of a tender symphony. He gave her time to pull away, to refuse, but she didn't. A strange warmth spread through her, like a small flame igniting from long-forgotten embers. As Jacob deepened the kiss, his fingers traced delicate lines across her skin, each touch a promise, each movement a quiet reassurance. Emily had never felt this before, her body responding to a man's touch for the first time, her heart pounding in a mix of fear and curiosity. "Are you all right?" Jacob whispered, his breath warm against her lips, like the caress of a summer wind. She nodded, though she still trembled like a leaf before a storm. "I thought so," he chuckled softly, his smile a blend of tenderness and quiet amusement. He kissed her forehead, the gesture as gentle as a father comforting a child after a nightmare. "Then let's take our time, Emily. There's no rush tonight. This is as much about you as it is about me." As Jacob continued to touch her with reverence, like an artist cherishing his most precious masterpiece, Emily realized something deeper than his words. This wasn't just about giving him an heir, a breath to continue the legacy. It was the beginning of something far greater than she had ever imagined, a bond invisible yet unbreakable, a journey she wasn't ready to name. There was no turning back. She lay down on the soft sheets, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird. Jacob's touch was steady, patient, but she still trembled beneath him, like a small boat untested by the waves. Sensing her hesitation, he cupped her cheek with a warmth that felt like firelight in the depths of winter. "Emily, you're shaking," he murmured, his voice as deep as waves lapping against the shore. "We don't have to do this tonight if you're not ready." She swallowed hard, looking into his eyes. There was no pressure, no demand, only an understanding as gentle as the sky after a storm. "No," she whispered, her voice small but resolute. "I want this. It's just. I don't know what to expect." Jacob exhaled, a breath that carried both relief and tenderness. His thumb traced slow, soothing circles on her skin. "Then we'll take it slow, all right? You don't have to do anything, just feel." She nodded, but her body remained taut, strung like a bow about to snap. Jacob leaned in, kissing her softly, guiding her into the moment with the patience of a steady hand. His lips moved down the curve of her jaw, leaving a warm trail against her chilled skin. Her breathing faltered, fingers gripping the sheets like someone on the edge of a precipice. She had always imagined her first time would be full of fear, but with Jacob, there was something else, something gentle, something she couldn't yet name. "Relax," he murmured against her ear, his voice a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. She focused on the way his hands moved over her, the way he treated her as something fragile, something to be cherished. Slowly, the tension melted from her muscles, like ice dissolving under the sun. Her body learned to trust him, piece by piece. Jacob never rushed, never pushed, every touch, every kiss was an invitation, not a demand. And when the final moment arrived, it came with a gentleness free of force. Emily gasped, her fingers digging into his arm. Jacob rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling as one. "I'm here," he whispered. "Just breathe." She did. And as the night stretched on, fear gave way to something new, something unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. The candlelight dimmed, the world outside faded into silence, and Emily lay in Jacob's arms, her body exhausted but her mind restless, like the sea stirring before a coming wind. She had crossed a threshold tonight, one she could never return from. "Are you all right?" Jacob's voice was soft, rustling like autumn leaves, his hand tracing lazy circles on her back. She nodded, pressing her face against his chest, where his heartbeat drummed steady and sure. "I think so." He kissed her forehead, whispering, "Thank you, Emily." She didn't reply, because deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a long journey. The next morning, Emily awoke in the warmth of Jacob's embrace, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist as if unwilling to let go. Last night had not been what she had imagined, not just duty, not just a promise, but something she had truly wanted. Morning light filtered through the curtains, reality settling in like a cold tide. Jacob stirred, his breath warm against her shoulder. "Good morning, Emily," he murmured, his voice husky with sleep and affection. She swallowed, unsure how to respond, and whispered back, "Good morning." Propping himself up on one elbow, he studied her face, his fingers tracing her cheek like an artist adding the final stroke to a masterpiece. "How do you feel?" he asked, his gaze deep, as though searching her soul. "Weird, different," she admitted hesitantly, her eyes dropping to avoid the intimacy in his stare. Jacob's lips curved into a faint smile, warm as the morning sun. "I hoped so." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Jacob," she said softly, hesitating as she spoke his name without formality. He corrected her gently, "No more, sir, Emily." She nodded, still struggling with the newfound closeness between them. "What happens now?" He took her hand, intertwining their fingers as if weaving two fates together. "Now," he said, "we wait to see if last night brought a miracle. I hope it did. But no matter what, you will never be alone." His words were a cool breeze against her restless heart, but Emily couldn't shake the weight pressing against her chest. She had given away her innocence, stepped past a point of no return. Jacob seemed at peace, but she was still lost in a whirlwind of emotions, unsure of how she truly felt about the path she had just begun. For weeks had passed since that fateful night, for weeks that felt like a lifetime in Emily's heart. She stood in the small bathroom, the pale white light casting a ghostly glow on her ashen face. Her hands trembled as she clutched the pregnancy test like a life sentence. Two bold lines appeared unmistakably, like two fateful strokes etched into her destiny. She was pregnant. Her breath came in short, frantic gasps, her chest rising and falling as if it might burst. She gripped the cold porcelain sink for balance as a whirlwind of emotions engulfed her, fear as suffocating as the darkness, exhilaration like sunlight piercing through storm clouds, and a deep, aching sorrow, a sorrow for Jacob, the man who had once begged for this child but might never get to hold it in his arms. "Jacob," she whispered, his name slipping from her lips like a prayer, her heart clenching as though squeezed by an invisible hand. She knew she had to tell him. In his spacious office, Jacob sat staring at the calendar on his polished mahogany desk. Red markings slashed across the dates like cruel reminders that time was slipping away mercilessly. The doctor had given him 6 months. No more. Now, only 5 remained, 5 fleeting months to live, to love, to hope. "Let me live long enough to hold my child," he murmured, his silent prayer lost in his shallow breath. "Let me see its face, hear its cry, just once." A gentle knock broke his thoughts, like a stone disturbing a still lake. Emily stepped in, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her gaze hesitant like a lost bird. Jacob looked up, and instantly, his eyes softened, like the moonlight kissing the midnight sea. "Emily, you look pale. Are you all right?" he asked, his voice deep and warm, tinged with concern. She drew in a shaky breath, stepping closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice small but steady, like a stream carving its way through stone. Jacob shot to his feet, his breath catching, his heart drumming like a war cry. He looked at her, at the shimmer in her eyes, the way she stood there, and he knew. "Emily, is it?" he asked, his voice unsteady, as if afraid the answer might be only a dream. She nodded, tears glistening like pearls as they fell onto her cheeks. "I'm pregnant, Jacob." A choked sound escaped him, half laughter, half sob, as he reached for her. His hands that had signed $1,000,000 contracts, now cradled her face as though holding the world itself. "You're carrying my child," he whispered, his voice breaking on the final word, as if unable to believe this miracle. Emily smiled through her tears. "Yes, we're having a baby." Jacob exhaled sharply, pressing his forehead to hers, and then he laughed, a frail, trembling laugh, but full of joy, mingling with the tears streaking down his hollow cheeks. "Thank you, Emily. Thank you." She held him tightly, feeling the tremors in his body. Joy flooded Jacob's heart, bright and warm like sunlight after a storm, but deep inside, a silent fear gnawed at him. Would he live long enough to see this child born? He pulled back, locking eyes with her, his gaze resolute like a vow. No matter what happens, Emily, I will make sure you and our child are taken care of. I promise. But in the depths of his heart, another prayer whispered, small, fragile, like a sigh in the wind, please, God, let me hold my child just once before I go. Time passed. 5 months had slipped away since that night, quiet and unforgiving. Emily sat on the velvet couch in the living room, her hand resting gently on her rounded belly, where their child grew stronger each day. But beside her, Jacob had grown weaker. The change in him was as stark as a fading painting under the relentless sun, a once strong figure now fragile like brittle twigs, his steps slow like a weary traveler at the end of his journey. His deep brown eyes, once sharp, now dulled by exhaustion, though he masked it with a weary smile. Emily watched him, her heart aching, not for his frailty, but because she knew time was stealing him away from her, from their child. Yet, through it all, something unexpected had bloomed between them, love. Emily couldn't pinpoint when it had begun, couldn't name the exact moment her heart tilted toward him. Perhaps it was the early mornings when Jacob would sit beside her, resting his hand on her belly and whispering to their unborn child with a voice rich and gentle, speaking of dreams and hopes. You'll be stronger than me, he would say, and kind like your mother. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her, his gaze tender as if she were the most precious thing in his world. Or perhaps it was moments like this, when they sat in peaceful silence, needing no words to understand each other. That evening, the golden dusk filtered through the grand windows, painting the room in soft amber light, gentle, like a farewell. Jacob took her hand, his fingers cold but still gripping tightly, as if unwilling to let go. You know, Emily, he said, his voice raspy but warm, I never thought I could be this happy, even with time against me. She smiled, her eyes shimmering. And I never thought I'd love the man who pulled me into this crazy mess. He chuckled, a faint, fragile sound, like a bell ringing in the wind. Crazy, but worth it, don't you think? Emily nodded, her hand brushing over her belly, feeling the tiny heartbeat within. The future was uncertain, the days ahead shadowed with loss, but she knew this love, delicate yet fierce, would be the fire that carried her and their child through the cold days to come. And as he pulled her into his arms, his breath warm against her hair, she whispered, yes, Jacob. Worth every single moment. Jacob's head rested gently on Emily's shoulder, his tousled silver hair brushing against her skin, carrying a frail yet familiar warmth. Are you comfortable? He whispered, his hoarse voice rustling like dry leaves in the wind. His hand shifted lightly, as if afraid to startle her. Emily smiled, threading her slender fingers through his hair, stroking it as if soothing a wounded bird. It should be me asking you that, she replied, her voice soft with a hint of teasing. Jacob chuckled, a faint, wispy sound, no longer the hearty laughter of his younger days. I'm fine, just tired, he said, his bony fingers tracing gentle circles on her rounded belly. His eyes softened, reflecting the stillness of moonlight over a quiet lake. I can't believe we're only 4 months away from meeting our child. Emily swallowed hard, the lump in her throat blocking the words she longed to say. 4 months, when the doctors had given Jacob only 6. Time was a cruel thief, silently shortening the precious days they had left. You'll be here, Jacob, she said firmly, though her voice trembled like a flower in the wind. You'll hold our baby. You have to. Jacob closed his eyes, a peaceful smile blooming on his lips like sunlight breaking through dark clouds. I'm fighting, Emily, he whispered, opening his eyes to look at her, his hand gripping hers tightly, clinging to her like a life raft in a vast ocean. Every day, I fight. And you give me a reason to keep going. Emily's heart clenched as if bound by invisible chains. She had never felt so tethered to another soul before. Jacob wasn't just the man who had begged her for a child, he was the missing piece she hadn't realized she lacked. Jacob, I. She hesitated, her chest heavy with the weight of a gathering storm. He looked at her, a flicker of hope in his weary eyes, like a lone star in an endless night. She took a deep breath, summoning her courage. I think I'm falling in love with you. Jacob's breath hitched. He was silent for a moment, then slowly lifted her face, his thumb gliding gently across her cheek like an artist's delicate brushstroke. You have no idea how much I love you, Emily, he murmured, his voice warm, wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. His words filled the empty spaces in her heart she hadn't known existed. She leaned into his embrace, his frail body radiating warmth, a silent promise. In that moment, Emily made a vow to herself: she would do everything to keep him here, with her, with their child, with the love that had blossomed in the midst of darkness. Time passed, and one day, in the hospital room, Emily's heart pounded like a battle drum as the doctor adjusted the ultrasound machine. Jacob sat beside her, his trembling hand clutching hers, his eyes shining with both anticipation and fear. The 6 months the doctors had predicted had come and gone, yet he was still here, still breathing, still holding her hand, still waiting for the miracle they had created together. All right, let's have a look, the doctor said, his voice calm, like a navigator guiding a ship through uncertain waters. The probe glided over Emily's swollen belly. The screen flickered, and then, strong, rhythmic heartbeats filled the room, a symphony of life echoing in the silence. Emily frowned in confusion. Doctor, too? The doctor smiled, his expression radiant like sunlight after a storm. Yes, 2. You're having twins, 2 healthy baby boys. Jacob gasped beside her, his hand covering his mouth, his wide eyes filled with shock. Twins, he whispered, barely loud enough to hear, as if speaking the words would shatter the dream. Emily turned to him, her own shock melting into tears of joy. We're having twins, Jacob. His eyes burned with a renewed light, his laughter, weak but full of life, bubbled up, his hands running over his face in disbelief. 2 boys, Emily. Do you know what this means? She nodded, placing her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his frail fingers. It means we've been blessed twice over. Jacob took a deep breath, his chest rising with emotion. I prayed to God to let me live long enough to see my child. And now he's given me 2. I don't deserve this mercy. Emily blinked away tears. You do, Jacob. You fought so hard. And you're still here. The doctor smiled, his eyes twinkling with joy on their behalf. The babies are strong. Just 1 more month, and I believe Jacob will be here to welcome them. As they left the hospital, hand in hand, Jacob looked up at the vast blue sky, his heart swelling with gratitude like a river overflowing its banks. Thank you, God. Thank you for this time, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Emily leaned into him, her love for him growing like a tree sprouting new leaves after a harsh winter. No matter what the future held, they had been given a miracle, not just 1, but 2, and she would cherish every moment. A month later, newborn cries echoed through the hospital room, strong and pure, like bells ringing at dawn. Emily lay exhausted but glowing, her eyes shimmering with tears as she gazed at the 2 tiny miracles in her arms. 2 healthy baby boys, wrapped in soft blue blankets, their rosy cheeks blooming like flowers in spring. Jacob stood beside her, his legs unsteady but his gaze unwavering, filled with awe. He stared at their tiny faces as if looking at the entire universe in miniature. His hands trembled as he reached out, gently cradling one of them, then carefully lifting him into his arms. They're so small, he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, as if he had just unearthed a hidden treasure. Emily smiled, shifting so he could hold the second baby as well. But they're yours, Jacob. You made it, you lived to see them. A tear slipped down his cheek, glistening like a jewel beneath the hospital lights. He looked from their sons to Emily, his vision blurred by happiness. I never thought, never dared to dream I'd make it this far, he said, kissing each of the babies on their foreheads, his breath trembling with the weight of his love. You have no idea how much I love you, Emily. She watched him, the way he whispered to their children, his love pouring out in every touch, every look. The man who had been told he had only 6 months to live now stood here, holding his twin sons, defying every cruel prediction. "You won, Jacob," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. He looked up at her and smiled, a weak, fragile smile, but radiant as the sun. "No, Emily," he whispered. "We won. Together." And in that moment, surrounded by the cries of new life and the soft morning light, they knew, love had carried them through the darkness, all the way to the edge of a miracle. 1 week after the birth of the twin boys, the entire world came to know Jacob Elijah, not through million-dollar contracts or the empire he built, but through a grand celebration at his sprawling estate. The entire mansion was adorned like a fairy tale palace, golden drapes cascading like streams of sunlight, fresh roses imported from abroad filling every corner with their intoxicating fragrance, and crystal chandeliers shimmering under the evening lights, shining like fallen stars. The air buzzed with excitement, laughter echoing as luxury cars rolled through the iron gates, carrying business moguls in sleek suits, celebrities with radiant smiles, and close family members eager to meet the twins, the heirs of the great Jacob. Emily stood by the grand staircase, her golden dress hugging her figure like the sun embracing a field of wheat. In her arms was one of the twin boys, his tiny eyes blinking with curiosity, while the other lay nestled in a soft blue blanket, held by a nanny beside her. She had never been the center of such an extravagant gathering, so many eyes upon her, so many whispers of awe, but tonight, she was no longer the timid maid she once was. She was the mother of Jacob's sons, the woman who had shared in creating a miracle. Jacob, clad in a sleek black suit, looked more powerful than ever, though his shoulders bore the weight of time. He stepped forward, took the microphone, and as the room fell silent, he cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces like a king addressing his subjects. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice resonated, deep and warm like the chime of an old clock, "tonight is not just a celebration. Tonight is living proof that miracles exist in this world. Months ago, doctors told me I would not live to see this day, they counted my days as if counting fallen autumn leaves. But here I stand, not just alive, but as the proudest father in the world." The crowd erupted in applause, a roaring tide of cheers and clinking glasses. Jacob turned to Emily and their sons, his eyes burning with an unyielding flame. "Allow me to introduce my sons, my heirs, Jason and Jordan Okafor." Thunderous applause filled the room, glasses of red wine lifted high, shimmering under the golden glow, blending into the shared joy of the moment. Emily gazed at Jacob, her heart swelling with love like a river rising after the rain. He had defied fate, walked past the shadow of death, and now stood here, proudly introducing his sons to the world. For the first time, she truly believed that love could be stronger than death, a force unseen yet powerful enough to scatter the darkest clouds. As the night faded into day, gentle sunlight streamed through the grand windows of the living room, casting a golden halo around Jacob. He sat in his favorite armchair, cradling the twin boys in his arms. Their tiny hands clutched onto his shirt as if holding onto the roots of a great tree. Their soft breaths synchronized with the faint rhythm of his heartbeat, composing a lullaby of quiet peace. He smiled down at them, his clouded eyes glistening with love and gratitude. "My sons," he whispered, his voice barely a breath, "you are the greatest blessing of my life." In the kitchen, Emily hummed an old tune, her hands skillfully preparing milk for the babies. She had never been happier, her heart light as a bird soaring in the endless sky. Jacob was still here, still fighting, and their family remained whole, a perfect picture she had once only dreamed of. Her love for him deepened each day, especially as she watched him as a father, how he held their children, how he whispered to them as if pouring his soul into every word. Carefully, she carried the bottles back to the living room, her footsteps light, as if afraid to disturb a beautiful dream. But the moment she stepped in, her heart froze, an icy chill piercing through her chest. Jacob sat motionless, his head slightly bowed, his arms still wrapped tightly around the twins like an eternal statue. His face was serene, lips slightly curled as if he had drifted into a peaceful sleep. But Emily knew, the air had changed, heavy and cold like the mist of an early morning. "Jacob," she called, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind as she stepped closer. No response. Her breath hitched. "Jacob, wake up, please." She reached out, touching his face, cold as stone, devoid of the warmth she once knew. Tears welled up, hot against her cheeks, as reality crumbled around her like a house shattered in a storm. A strangled sob escaped her lips as she fell to her knees beside him, grasping his arm as if trying to hold on to the soul that had just slipped away. "No, no, Jacob, don't leave us." The twins stirred in his arms, their tiny whimpers slicing through the suffocating silence like daggers to her heart. Even in death, Jacob held them close, keeping them safe, a devoted father until his very last breath. Emily pressed her forehead against his, her tears soaking his lifeless skin, her voice breaking. "You said you'd stay, you said you'd fight." But then, through her grief, she remembered his words, as soft as a passing breeze, "I just want to live long enough to hold my children." And he had. He had lived to meet them, to love them, to give them his final breath. The sorrow crushed her like a wave, but through the veil of tears, Emily found a bittersweet comfort, as warm as sunlight after the rain. He had left this world with his greatest joy in his arms, the two sons he had longed for. Wiping her tears, she gently lifted Jason and Jordan from his unmoving embrace, holding them close to her chest. Their tiny warmth soothed the gaping wound in her heart. "I will take care of them, Jacob," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm as a vow carried by the wind. "I promise." Looking into the innocent eyes of her sons, she saw Jacob in their tiny smiles, in their curious gazes, in the love he had left behind, a love that burned like an undying flame. Death had taken him, but his love remained, living on in every heartbeat of Jason and Jordan, in every story she would tell them about the father who fought for them. "Thank you, Jacob," she murmured to the empty space, her voice as soft as a prayer sent to the heavens. "For giving me everything."